It was supposed to be a routine night at the docks. A cargo ship arrived, guards followed their patrols, and yet in less than an hour, more than $20 million vanished. No alarms, no witnesses, no explanation. Who pulled off the impossible heist, and why does the shadow of that night still haunt everyone involved? This is a story of greed, betrayal, and a crime that changed everything. The story begins on a humid summer night in July 1976, in the industrial port district of Newark, New Jersey, where the Hudson River swelled with cargo ships and tankers, their silhouettes marked by blinking lights against the smoggy skyline. A period when organized crime had a grip on waterfront operations and law enforcement struggled to keep pace with the sophistication of schemes that seemed too precise, too professional to be spontaneous. What happened on that night would later be described in FBI files as one of the most daring and meticulously planned maritime robberies in U.S. history, and it started with a ship called the Argosy, a Panamanian-registered freighter carrying more than $20 million in U.S. currency bound for overseas banks, its hold secured with steel vault containers, the kind typically used for Federal Reserve transfers, and the crew ordered to keep radio silence for most of its stay in port. That sum, $20 million in unmarked bills, was meant to vanish into the global banking system, but before it could leave the dock, someone else had already decided it would never reach its destination. To understand how the impossible was made possible, one has to step back into the daily rhythm of Newark's port in the mid-1970s. A world of forklifts whining on oil-stained asphalt, longshoremen shouting over the screech of cranes lowering shipping containers, the thick smell of diesel and salt water mixing with coffee from roadside diners, and the ever-present awareness that the mob watched everything from the shadows. Security at Pier 14 was considered tight for the time, with armed guards at 2 checkpoints, watchtowers overlooking the water, and sealed manifests logged by U.S. Customs officers. Yet those precautions seemed almost laughable compared to the sophistication of what was about to unfold. The man suspected of orchestrating the heist was never formally charged, but investigators and later journalists consistently pointed to a figure named Vince Caruso, then 39 years old, son of a dockworker, former Marine turned hustler, with a reputation for both discipline and ruthlessness. Caruso had worked the piers as a teenager, learned every routine of cargo loading, and by his late 20s was already running a crew involved in hijacking trucks along the New Jersey Turnpike. But this was different. This was an operation that required military precision and inside help. The inside help likely came from a man named Thomas Brennan, a 32-year-old shipping clerk at Pier 14, whose life looked unremarkable on paper. Divorced, one child he rarely saw, perpetually behind on child support, living in a small apartment above a laundromat, Brennan had access to shipping manifests and coded schedules that listed high-value transfers, and he knew that the Argosy's arrival had been deliberately downplayed in official logs, flagged only as commercial goods rather than currency, a tactic meant to disguise the importance of the cargo, but to someone like Caruso, that discrepancy itself was a signal worth investigating. On July 10, 3 nights before the robbery, Brennan sat in his kitchen staring at the manifest papers with trembling hands, the sound of a buzzing neon sign from the laundromat below filling the silence. He thought about the risk, about what would happen if anyone traced the leak back to him, and yet the promise of a cut, rumor said $500,000 just for providing schedules, was too intoxicating, more money than he could make in a decade of clerical work, and in his mind he justified it with thoughts like, "They'll never catch me, I'm just a clerk, a nobody who would suspect me?" The planning stretched back months. Caruso's crew rented a warehouse 2 miles from the docks under the guise of a shipping company, outfitted it with fake paperwork, forklifts, and uniforms that perfectly mimicked the Port Authority's colors, studied guard rotations down to the minute, and even rehearsed the entire operation with empty containers. One of Caruso's associates, a man named Red Lasky, who had served in Vietnam as a demolition specialist, designed custom cutting tools to silently break through cargo seals without leaving obvious tampering marks, and another member, Joseph Marinelli, secured 2 unmarked trucks with false license plates, timed to enter the pier under the cover of a scheduled shift change. Everything depended on precision timing. The manifest showed that the Argosy's vault containers were to be moved from the ship's hold to a secure customs warehouse at 2 a.m. on July 13, then held there until federal couriers arrived at 6 a.m. That 4-hour window was when the money would be most vulnerable, and Caruso's plan hinged on intercepting the cargo not at the dockside, where guards were alert, But during the short transfer across a fenced yard, a distance of no more than 200 yards yet carrying a fortune that weighed nearly 3 tons in bundled cash. At 1:50 a.m., under a drizzle that streaked the sodium lights, the plan moved into action. A Port Authority truck rolled forward from the pier, carrying 2 sealed vault containers. The guards at the checkpoint noted nothing unusual. License plates matched, paperwork was in order, and the truck was waved through toward the warehouse. But what they didn't know was that the driver and his co-driver were not legitimate employees but members of Caruso's crew, disguised in near-perfect uniforms with forged IDs that Brennan had helped replicate from discarded forms. Meanwhile, the real transfer truck had been quietly delayed, its driver waylaid by a staged fender bender a mile away where another of Caruso's men had rammed his car, keeping him tied up in police reports. Witness accounts later collected described how eerily smooth the swap appeared. It looked official, one dock worker recalled, like any other night. If you weren't counting minutes you wouldn't notice a thing. The truck rolled not toward the customs warehouse but directly to the rented warehouse under Caruso's control, where the containers were offloaded with practiced efficiency, forklifts moving under dim lights, men in gloves prying open steel seals with Lasky's tools. When the first vault door finally cracked, what spilled out was beyond what many of them had imagined. Bricks of US $100 bills stacked in canvas bundles, some marked with Federal Reserve tags, the sheer volume so overwhelming that one of the crew reportedly muttered, "Jesus Christ, it's like a bank exploded in here." In total, more than $20 million vanished in less than 30 minutes, without a single gunshot, without triggering any alarms, a robbery so clean it would take hours before anyone realized the cargo had never reached its intended warehouse. Meanwhile, at the dock, Brennan pretended to work as usual, filing forms, his heart pounding as he watched the clock tick past 2:15, then 2:30, rehearsing in his mind the alibi he had crafted, that he'd gone for coffee during the transfer, that he saw nothing unusual. But deep inside he already felt the first pangs of dread, because he knew Caruso's rule: no loose ends, and being the inside man meant his life was worth less than the paper he handled. When dawn broke over Newark, the missing containers had still not been reported. It wasn't until 6:10 a.m., when the federal couriers arrived at the customs warehouse and demanded access, that officials realized the cargo was gone. What followed was chaos: guards shouting, phones ringing off the hook, supervisors demanding explanations. Yet the logs showed nothing wrong. The truck had been waved through, paperwork stamped, everything official, and in those first hours it was as if the 20 million had simply evaporated into the morning air. FBI files note that the first call about the theft came at 7:45 a.m., and by 9 o'clock agents were already on the ground, their black sedans parked outside Pier 14, interviewing bleary-eyed dock workers. One agent later wrote in his report, "It had all the hallmarks of an inside job, too perfect, too surgical. No amateur could have pulled this off." The investigation quickly centered on the narrow time window between 2 o'clock and 2:30 a.m., but surveillance cameras at the port were grainy, half of them malfunctioning, and the only footage captured was a blurry truck rolling through the gate, impossible to distinguish from the dozens of others that passed each night. While law enforcement scrambled, Caruso and his men had already divided the cash into smaller shipments, packing them into crates labeled as machine parts, destined to be driven out of state by sunrise. Each man took a cut, though Caruso kept the lion's share locked in hidden safes, and for Brennan his envelope of cash, bundles totaling nearly $500,000, felt heavier than anything he had ever held, both a promise and a death sentence. In later interviews decades after, one retired agent said, "From the beginning we knew we were chasing ghosts. By the time we realized what happened, the money was already scattered across half the country." But questions lingered. How did Brennan first come into contact with Caruso? Why did the guards fail to notice subtle discrepancies? And most hauntingly, what exactly happened inside that rented warehouse the morning after the heist, when rumors suggested that not everyone who participated lived long enough to spend their share? Part 1 of the story ends here, with 2 images burned into memory: the sight of federal agents staring at an empty warehouse bay where millions should have been, and the silent trucks already miles away on the highway, carrying fortunes into the unknown, leaving behind only questions that would haunt investigators for decades. By the time the sun rose fully over Newark on July 13, 1976, the scope of the crime began to register not just as a theft but as a national embarrassment, because $20 million in unmarked currency had vanished under the noses of customs officers and port security, and within hours the FBI, the Treasury Department, and even federal marshals were scrambling to assemble joint task forces. Newspapers the following day ran headlines like, 20 million vanishes from ship in Newark, and port security breached in daring heist, though the public details remained vague, since officials feared that revealing too much would embolden copycats or expose how fragile their systems actually were. Inside the customs warehouse, investigators replayed the timeline again and again. The truck logged at 1:55 a.m., the guard's initials on the manifest, the lack of any distress calls from the crew, and the simple but devastating realization that someone with inside knowledge had orchestrated a flawless substitution. Almost immediately suspicion fell on port employees, and among them Thomas Brennan stood out, not because he made an obvious mistake, but because he was one of the few clerks with access to detailed schedules and manifests that identified high-value cargo. Brennan was interviewed by agents that same day, sweating under fluorescent lights as he insisted he had been at his desk, had gone for coffee, had noticed nothing. His voice trembling as he repeated, "I just stamp what they give me, I don't ask questions." The agents let him go, but notes in their reports read, "Nervous, evasive, may know more than he admits," and Brennan felt the walls closing in long before any direct evidence linked him. Meanwhile Caruso's crew dispersed into the shadows of New Jersey, Brooklyn, and Staten Island, some carrying their cuts in duffel bags, others stashing bills inside false walls of warehouses. But the problem with sudden wealth was that it drew attention. Within days one member, Joseph Marinelli, attempted to purchase a new Cadillac in cash, raising suspicion from a salesman who quietly reported it to police, while another, Red Lasky, was seen flashing stacks of hundreds in a bar, his brashness sowing seeds of paranoia within the crew that someone would slip up and draw law enforcement straight to them. FBI Task Force Commander Special Agent Richard Donnelly, a grizzled veteran of organized crime investigations, announced in a press briefing that no stone will be left unturned. This was not a random theft but a coordinated operation requiring military precision, and privately he told his team that the case reminded him of the Lufthansa heist rumors out of JFK Airport, the kind of inside job where loyalty and silence were as important as guns. Surveillance operations began almost immediately. Unmarked cars following known associates of Caruso, wiretaps placed on payphones near the docks, and informants pressured to provide names, though fear of retribution made most clam up. One dockworker told investigators off the record, "You think anyone's gonna talk about Vince Caruso? He runs those piers like a general. If he finds out you even said his name, you disappear." Despite the silence, cracks began to show within the conspiracy itself. Brennan, terrified that agents would eventually connect the dots, started drinking heavily, muttering in bars about being in too deep, while Caruso grew increasingly suspicious of him, reportedly telling one associate, "The clerk's weak men are liabilities." Federal investigators meanwhile traced the fake truck used in the heist to a rental company in Elizabeth, New Jersey, where records showed it had been signed out under a false name with counterfeit identification. Forensic checks revealed fingerprints, though most were smudged or partial, but one faint print matched a known associate of Caruso, giving the FBI their first concrete link. By late July agents had enough to quietly bring Marinelli in for questioning, though he denied everything, claiming he had been home with his wife the night of the robbery. Still, the inconsistencies in his statements, combined with the suspicious Cadillac purchase, convinced investigators that the crew had begun spending the money, and the case shifted from reconstructing the heist to following the money trail. Yet every lead seemed to circle back to a frustrating reality. The bulk of the $20 million remained unaccounted for, and even if bills surfaced, proving they came from the Argosy cargo was nearly impossible without serial number records, many of which were missing or incomplete in federal archives. Inside Caruso's circle, paranoia reached a fever pitch. Some believed Brennan had already flipped to the feds, others whispered that Marinelli's loose tongue would doom them all, and one night in August, according to later testimonies, Brennan vanished. Neighbors reported last seeing him leaving his apartment with two men, never to return. His disappearance never solved, though privately investigators believed Caruso had ordered his elimination to plug the leak. Brennan's absence only deepened the mystery, with FBI agents noting, "Our prime suspect is suddenly gone, no trace, no body, no closure," and it turned the case into a story not just of stolen money but of vanished men, layers of disappearance that hinted at the ruthlessness behind the operation. As the months dragged on, the federal task force pursued leads across state lines. cash surfacing in Miami banks, whispers of laundering through Atlantic City casinos, and rumors that parts of the haul had been smuggled overseas to Italy through connections with Sicilian mafiosi. Though none of these trails produced definitive proof, the heist seemed to dissolve into the fog of rumor and speculation, a perfect crime whose perpetrators either silenced themselves or were silenced by their own. By 1977 the official investigation slowed, agents reassigned, files stacked into archives, but the mystery endured, gnawing at investigators like Donnelly, who admitted in a 1985 interview, "It was the one that got away. Every time we thought we had a lead it slipped, and I can't help but think someone on the inside higher than we knew wanted it buried." In later decades, journalists revisiting the case uncovered fragments, unsealed court documents, declassified FBI memos, that suggested corruption within the Port Authority itself, possibly explaining why certain cameras failed, why guard logs showed no anomalies, why some witnesses suddenly recanted their stories. One theory held that elements within law enforcement had been paid off to look the other way, making the heist less of a daring robbery and more of a sanctioned theft disguised as crime. The psychological toll on those involved was equally devastating. Marinelli, once brash, was found shot dead in 1979 in what police called a gangland execution. Lasky disappeared in 1981 after boasting too loudly in a Queens bar, and Caruso himself seemed to vanish from records after the early 1980s, some claiming he retired quietly in Florida, others insisting he was buried in an unmarked grave after crossing the wrong people. Each absence left investigators with more questions, like a puzzle where pieces were deliberately removed. For the families of men like Brennan, the disappearance meant decades of uncertainty, a child who grew up without a father, never knowing whether he had been a criminal or a victim, and for investigators it became a cold case legend, whispered about in FBI halls as the $20 million ghost. In 1996, a new wave of interest revived the file when declassified Treasury documents revealed that portions of the stolen bills had surfaced in Europe during the late 1970s, exchanged in discrete bank transactions that hinted at a laundering pipeline stretching far beyond Newark, and modern analysts suggested that Caruso's crew may have been just the front end of a larger international scheme. But the emotional weight of the case remained in the human details. The fear in Brennan's eyes during his last interview, the frustration in Donnelly's voice as he admitted defeat, the unanswered calls to families who never received closure. What began as a surgical heist had become, over 2 decades, a haunting saga of missing money, missing men, and missing truth, a story that no courtroom ever resolved and no confession ever closed. And yet, in the late 1990s, investigators uncovered a sealed box of evidence mislabeled in a federal storage facility. Photographs of the rented warehouse, fragments of forged IDs, and one note scribbled in Brennan's handwriting, "They don't know what's coming," a chilling reminder that he may have foreseen the betrayal waiting for him. That rediscovery rekindled old suspicions. Was Brennan truly the weak link, or was he about to expose something larger before being silenced? And more disturbingly, did the $20 million serve not just as a prize for thieves but as fuel for networks of corruption that reached far higher than anyone dared admit? As the 20th century drew to a close, the case of the Argosy heist remained officially unsolved, its money scattered, its conspirators dead or vanished, its truths buried in layers of silence. But whispers continued among investigators that files still sealed held answers too damaging to release. Part 2 ends not with resolution but with renewed intrigue, the image of that scribbled note suggesting a betrayal within a betrayal, and the lingering question that set the stage for the courtroom battles, moral reckonings, and final revelations still to come. By the early 2000s the Argosy heist had long since slipped into the realm of legend, a case cited in law enforcement academies as the perfect example of an unsolved crime whose thread stretched across decades, but then a surprising development brought it back into the spotlight. Federal prosecutors in New York, armed with newly declassified files and the emergence of a long-silent witness, quietly reopened the investigation, framing it not as a cold robbery case but as a conspiracy involving corruption, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. This was the opportunity, they believed, to finally drag the shadows into the courtroom. The witness was Anthony "Tony" Bellini, a former low-level associate of Caruso's who had entered witness protection in the 1980s after a drug case. Now in his 60s, terminally ill and facing his mortality, Bellini agreed to testify about what he had seen. The meetings in dingy warehouses, the counterfeit IDs prepared in advance, Brennan's nervous breakdown, and the night Brennan was allegedly taken away and never returned. Bellini's testimony, though decades old, was devastating, painting Caruso as the mastermind who had not only orchestrated the theft but also ordered multiple murders to silence potential leaks. Court transcripts captured his trembling voice as he said, "Brennan wasn't no mastermind, he was a scared kid with a family. Caruso used him, then threw him away." The prosecution built its case on this testimony, combined with financial records tying laundered money to casino accounts in Atlantic City and wire transfers flagged in Swiss banks during the late 1970s, presenting a narrative that the $20 million had been funneled into organized crime coffers rather than simply spent by reckless thieves. In court, however, the defense hammered on the lack of physical evidence. No recovered cash, no bodies, no direct link beyond the word of a dying man and incomplete records. They argued that Bellini was embellishing to secure a better deal for his family, that memories after 30 years were unreliable, and that the government was trying to rewrite history to claim a victory in a case they had failed to solve. Yet the courtroom drama captivated the public, with newspapers dubbing it the last trial of the $1 million ghosts, and television networks revisiting archival footage of Newark in the 1970s, showing grainy images of the port, the missing containers and grim-faced FBI agents. Families of the vanished men filled the gallery, Brennan's daughter, now an adult woman, sitting in the front row, her face tight with decades of unanswered questions, silently willing the court to acknowledge her father not as a villain but as a victim caught in the gears of something far larger. As testimony unfolded, new revelations shocked even seasoned reporters. Bellini claimed that certain customs officers had been bribed to falsify logs, that the FBI had an informant inside Caruso's circle who later disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and that some of the stolen money was used to fund political campaigns in New Jersey, suggesting the reach of the crime extended far beyond gangsters. Prosecutors hinted at sealed files that corroborated these claims but said their contents were too sensitive to release, leaving the jury with tantalizing fragments but no full picture, a strategy that both reinforced the aura of conspiracy and frustrated those craving hard proof. When closing arguments arrived, the prosecution framed the case as not just about money but about truth. $20 million was stolen, but what was truly taken was the faith of ordinary people that justice protects them. This trial is the last chance to restore that faith. The defense countered with sharp skepticism. You cannot convict ghosts. The government wants you to convict memories, rumors, and shadows. After weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a split verdict. 2 surviving associates were found guilty of racketeering and conspiracy, sentenced to decades in prison despite their advanced age, but Caruso himself, long presumed dead, was never formally charged, his absence hanging over the proceedings like a specter. For the families, the verdict brought only partial closure. Brennan's daughter spoke outside the courthouse, her words broadcast on national news. They admitted he was used, but they'll never admit what really happened. My father's name is still trapped in that shadow. Investigators privately acknowledged that much of the money would never be recovered, that most of the men involved were dead, and that the full extent of corruption tied to the case would likely remain sealed forever. Yet in the end the trial accomplished something intangible. It dragged the Argosy heist back into light, forced names into public record, and left a lasting moral lesson echoed by Judge Hamilton during sentencing. The greatest cost of this crime was not measured in stolen bills, but in the years of silence, fear, and unanswered questions that followed. It reminds us that time does not erase guilt, and truth, no matter how late, demands its day. As the courtroom emptied and reporters filed their final stories, the image of Brennan's note, "They don't know what's coming," lingered as the unresolved heart of the mystery, a reminder that even after decades of trials, testimonies, and theories, the full story of the $20 million ghost remained just out of reach, a case both closed and unfinished, its secrets buried as deeply as the men who carried them to their graves. The night after their narrow escape from the Coast Guard was heavy with tension. The air inside the hidden warehouse where the crew had decided to lay low was thick with cigarette smoke and the lingering smell of salt water on their clothes. Every man and woman in the group too wired to sleep yet too exhausted to think clearly, and as the dim yellow lights buzzed above, casting long shadows over the stacks of crates that disguised their stolen treasure, arguments began to surface, quiet at first and then louder, because $20 million in unmarked bills wasn't just money, it was temptation, it was betrayal waiting to happen, and even as their leader tried to keep order, telling them that the plan was to wait 3 more days before moving the cash inland with forged documents and false trucking manifests. The cracks were already forming, because greed whispered in their ears that waiting meant risking, and risk meant losing everything, so whispers of splitting off with their share, of leaving under cover of darkness, crept through the crew, poisoning their fragile trust. And while some sharpened their knives or loaded pistols in the corner as a not-so-subtle reminder that loyalty was the only thing holding them together, others exchanged looks that promised nothing good, and in the middle of it all, the sound of sirens somewhere far away in the night made them freeze, wondering if the Coast Guard had tracked them, if someone had already talked, if the fortune stacked inside the crates was going to burn away with their lives before dawn. But the sirens faded and silence returned, heavy and suffocating, and though no shots were fired that night, everyone knew the real storm was coming, not from outside but from within, because $20 million wasn't just paper, it was blood money, and sooner or later it was going to demand payment in a currency more costly than gold. By the 5th night, the stolen fortune that had once felt like salvation now hung over the crew like a curse, $20 million stacked in crates inside that damp warehouse eating away at whatever scraps of loyalty they had left, and the air was colder now, tense, carrying the smell of diesel from the nearby docks and the constant creak of old wood as if the building itself knew that violence was close, because the men barely spoke without suspicion and the women sharpened their eyes as much as their blades, every glance turning into an accusation, every sound outside mistaken for the Coast Guard, and as their leader tried to keep discipline, pacing in front of the crates and warning them that anyone who thought about slipping away would only draw the kind of attention that would bury them all, he could see in their faces that the warning meant nothing anymore, because greed had already carved its mark, deep and irreversible, and the whispers spread like rot through the night. Promises of secret partnerships and private shares, until one of them, nervous and drunk, tried to sneak out with a bag of bills tucked under his coat, only to be caught at the door, his trembling hand on the handle, and the silence that followed was worse than any scream, because they all knew what had to happen, and when the gunshot cracked through the warehouse, echoing like a death knell, it wasn't just him who fell, it was the last thread of unity snapping, the sound of trust bleeding out across the cold floor, and in that instant every man and woman knew they were no longer a crew but rivals trapped together by fear, each with a gun close at hand, each calculating whether the pile of cash was worth the life of the person standing next to them. And as the body was dragged outside into the dark, the leader realized the greatest threat wasn't the Coast Guard or the authorities but the people he once called brothers and sisters, because $20 million had turned them into wolves, and wolves didn't share, they devoured, and the clock was ticking fast toward a bloody reckoning that no one would escape clean. The warehouse had become a coffin without nails, a box of rotting trust holding together men and women who no longer believed in the promises that had brought them this far. And in the 6th night since they had struck the ship and vanished into the night with more than $20 million, everything that had once seemed clear was now blurred by greed, paranoia, and the endless weight of time pressing down on them, because the longer they waited, the heavier the silence grew, and the heavier the silence grew, the more dangerous each of them became, and when morning broke through the broken windows and pale streaks of light, the body of the man they had shot for trying to run still lingered in their minds, his absence louder than his presence had ever been, a reminder that hesitation had no place anymore, yet hesitation was all they carried now, because no one knew who might be next, and though the leader tried to keep control, his voice was beginning to sound thin like a preacher speaking to an empty church because the congregation was already gone in their hearts, their eyes fixed not on him but on the crates stacked in the corner that contained the fortune that was supposed to save them but instead had begun to kill them piece by piece. And when the 3rd day of hiding turned to the 4th, their nerves frayed so thin that even the smallest sound, the creak of a door, the flutter of wings in the rafters, the scrape of boots across the concrete, sent hands reaching for guns, and it was inevitable that someone would pull the trigger again, because guns in the hands of desperate people don't wait for justice, they wait for the slightest excuse, and when 2 of them clashed over a rumor that one had been cutting deals outside the crew, the confrontation escalated into screams and then into fire, bullets sparking off metal beams and cracking into wooden crates until one of them dropped and the other fled into the shadows, leaving the echo of gunpowder hanging thick in the air, and though the leader shouted for order, for calm, his voice drowned beneath the ringing in their ears and the realization that blood had once again been spilled over money that none of them could even spend yet, and in that moment the warehouse stopped being a hideout and became a battleground where alliances were as fragile as glass, shifting by the hour, because some still believed they could make it out together while others had already decided the only path forward was to cut the crew down until fewer hands reached for the prize, and all the while outside the authorities closed in, piecing together the trail they had left behind, the ship's empty hull telling a story that spread quickly through the underworld and into the ears of informants who sold secrets for survival. And though the crew believed they were hidden, the noose was tightening, each passing night drawing law enforcement closer, until the point came when the crew was fighting. Not just ghosts of betrayal but the very real shadow of flashing lights and the low growl of engines in the distance. And when one of the women insisted she had seen movement near the docks, that someone was watching them, the argument that followed nearly tore them apart again, half of them demanding they move the money immediately and the other half refusing to risk exposure. But by then the decision no longer belonged to them, because the first shot fired that night didn't come from within, but from outside, a bullet splintering through the wooden walls and driving them all to the floor, and chaos erupted, some firing blindly into the dark, others rushing to secure the crates, and in that moment the illusion of control shattered completely, because survival now meant choosing between defending the fortune and defending their lives. And though some still clung to the belief that the money made all the blood worth it, others realized too late that no amount of bills could buy back the time they had lost or the trust they had burned, and the firefight stretched through the night, the sound of gunfire echoing across the docks, until at last the shooting stopped and the smoke thinned and the survivors realized that they were no longer a crew but scattered individuals trapped in a nightmare of their own making, some bleeding, some hiding, all consumed by the same thought, that $20 million had been the beginning of their end, and whether they escaped or died in that warehouse they had already lost more than they could ever count, because money had stolen not just their freedom but their souls. And as dawn broke once again over the water, painting the horizon in pale fire, the survivors faced the truth they had tried to ignore all along, that the treasure they had stolen was not a blessing but a curse, and it would claim every one of them before it was through.